Welcome. My name is Amanda Hormger. I'm the program director at the Jewish Federation of Bergen-Belsen and the co-chair of Literature Berks. On behalf of our entire committee, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this series of programs. Literature Berks is a community-wide celebration of books and authors presented by the Jewish Federation of Bergen-Belsen in partnership with the Exeter Community Library and Sinking Spring Public Library and the Jewish Book Council. In the chat, you will see a link to purchase All the Horrors of War. You can purchase it through our official book vendor, Reeds and Company Bookshop, which we're happy to support a local independent bookshop. And I also have a link to Johns Hopkins University Press, which has the book for 40% off for the next couple of days. So I encourage you to support both those options. And remember that books always make a great gift. Throughout the webinar, feel free to type any questions you may have into the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer questions throughout the program. Before and after she served as the director of Boston University's Center for the Advancement of Ethics and Character, now the Center for Character and Social Responsibility, Bernice worked at Hebrew College, most recently as Dean of Adult Learning. All told, she has more than 25 years of experience in the field of adult education. It has been her privilege to create and implement innovative programs, lead productive teams, and work with outstanding faculty in the realms of philosophy, education, and Jewish studies. She has lectured widely in a variety of settings, including in Indonesia, Japan, and Singapore. Stateside, she has given presentations at numerous conferences and addressed faculty and staff of both private and public schools. She has a bachelor's from Stony Brook University, a master's from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and a doctorate from Boston University. Among the courses she taught at Boston University were resistance during the Holocaust and character and ethics education. She also designed and taught ethical decision-making for education leaders for Northeastern University's College of Professional Studies. I'm honored to welcome Bernice Lerner to Literature Berks.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you to everyone who's here, who attended. I know that you have a lot of options of things to do this evening, so I'm very grateful that you're here with us. I will give about a 25 minute slide presentation having to do with my book, and then I'd be happy to take any questions from you. So at this point, I'm going to share my screen. Host disabled it. Okay, so let's see. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so somehow it's not, the host disabled my screen sharing.
Let me see. I think I just fixed it. Let's see if that worked.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
There we go.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So I authored this book, All the Horrors of War. A Jewish girl, a British doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And I'm just showing you this first slide because it's the same exact book. It was published simultaneously in the UK and the US, but you can see the very different things that the publishers did with the same images. There's different titles and different cover designs. But the girl standing in this picture, To Meet in Hell, the UK version, and up here, that's my mom. And this is a picture of her when she's 16 years old, orphaned. Her parents and her 4 younger siblings died in Auschwitz, though lately from my research, I'm not 100% sure that's where my grandfather died, but they died during the Holocaust, and only she and her older sister survived. Here she is in Arvika Sanatorium, tuberculosis sanatorium. She's very sick. And she's very sad, and it's the snowy place in northwest Sweden, and they're trying to rehabilitate her. On the top, you see Glenn Hughes. This is a man that I met through my research. I didn't meet him live in person. He died in 1973, but I met him through reading about him. He is the liberator most prominently associated with the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen, which was the largest Nazi death camp at the end of World War II in the spring. And he was totally shocked coming into this camp. He was at that time serving as Deputy Director of Medical Services for the British Second Army, and he was in charge of a group of very war-weary men, field ambulances and casualty clearing stations, and his assistant directors of medical services. And he came into this camp that was totally a surprise. And When I was researching how precisely my mother survived, because she had told me stories my whole entire life, but she blanked out at the part that she was actually rescued. She had fallen unconscious then and didn't have a memory of it. So I was sort of interested in like how, like, why am I here? Like, how did she survive? How did she make it? The norm in this place was death. 17,000 people died in March of 1945 in Bergen-Belsen. More than 36,000 died from January till the liberation in Bergen-Belsen. 500 were dying each day after the liberation for a month. I mean, how did this kid make it? And I discovered Glenn Hughes. He was in charge of the relief efforts, and he turned out to be a find. He was sort of this Oscar Schindler type figure that nobody really knew about, and he just embraced his role as in saving Jewish lives. His motivation was absolutely moral. It was a really hard situation he found himself in. There was very few units he could call upon for help. He tried to get his bearings and get help from wherever he could. How would they try to rescue people? There were 60,000 war-ravaged people in this camp who had been dumped there, deposited there, and 25,000 were in need of immediate hospitalization. So how was he going to organize the relief? Well, his motivation was moral, as I said, because he decided right away that he would try to save as many lives as possible. So I tell the story. My book is told over 1 year, the last year of World War II. It's very dramatic, and to me, it's sort of a race against time story. Because I focus on the human, I think that's the way we can gain access to the story. The big numbers are very abstract. So I have these two protagonists, these two characters, my mother and the brigadier. And I tried in writing this. It took me many years to write this book, to even get to writing about my mother. And my approach that really helped me was to sort of distance myself from the fact that this is my mother. I sort of looked at her as, who is this character? Like, who's this little girl who's going through this? What type of person is she? What assets, what endowments did she bring to this extreme experience? I mean, she was from Siget, Transylvania, same town as Elie Wiesel. Her house was just a 4-minute walk from his. And she was a very different type of character than Anne Frank, who was a little bit older than her. She had a very hard-scrabble childhood. She had a lot of responsibility as a child. She was the second of 6 children. She had to leave school at one point to help support the family. So who was she? Who was this kid? And what was she thinking and feeling as she went through this? And someone who had to grow up very quickly, but who was still at heart an adolescent who hadn't seen or experienced very much before. And then who was this man? Like, what did he bring? What was his background like? And what had he seen before he got to Bergen-Belsen? I mean, here he is in the spring of 1944. He's deputy director of medical services for the British Army's 8th Corps. And he's one of the people who is really organizing the medical rescue during the D-Day landings. And he's preparing for it. And then what's it like once he gets to Normandy? And how's he following the progress of the battles? And how's he evacuating soldiers and seeing to their medical care and overseeing that whole gigantic operation as they're fighting in Normandy up through Belgium into the Netherlands and finally crossing the fortress of Germany, which was as dramatic and difficult as the D-Day landing, and then coming to this place, this hell in northwest Germany called Bergen-Belsen. So this is where the two lives, two respective journeys collide. And again, I go into this granular detail of these lives, but they tell a much larger story because, of course, this happened to so many people. There was so many people involved in both as victims of Hitler's scourge and as rescuers. So it's a sort of truth is stranger than fiction story of how Bergen-Belsen happened to be handed over at the end of the war to the Allies, to the British Army, because on April 4th, just to give you an idea, Heinrich Himmler ordered the commandant of Flossenburg and Dachau that absolutely no victims were to be handed over alive to the Allied forces, and there was a lot of talks about bombing Bergen-Belsen or different methods of killing people in Bergen-Belsen, which I talk about in my book. But through his masseuse, Himmler's masseuse, and other channels, other things that's also detailed in the book, the Germans decided that they were going to enter into a truce on April 12th with the British. And they turned over Bergen-Belsen, and on April 15th, the British Second Army, units of the British Second Army entered. And one of the stipulations of the truce was that there had to be danger typhus signs everywhere. There were 3 epidemics raging in the camp, and there was probably every disease known to man. There was a typhus epidemic. There was gastroenteritis. The huts were the floor was just full of human excreta. There were no lavatory facilities, and there was tuberculosis. So the bottom picture is a picture of the camp. There were 3 compounds on one side, 2 on the other, and there was a road bisecting the camp. And at the end, I don't know whether it was this end or that end, there were the mass burial pits. And one of the things that they tried to do on April 12th and 13th and 14th is clean up the camp before the British came in. So they organized this macabre parade where inmates who could still walk were forced to drag those who were dead or just 90% dead to these mass graves down this road. And I remember the night that my mom was telling me, this was before the word Holocaust was even in modern parlance. This was like the war, and she hadn't talked about it really to anybody. She was just telling me about her experiences. And I remember one night we were downstairs in the basement laundry room, and she put down the iron and she leaned forward and stretched her hands out behind her and demonstrated for me how she, who was 50% dead, was forced to hold on to the skeletons like ankles and drag them down this road to the mass grave. And I think that probably changes a person forever. So I really tremble in showing you the pictures of Bergen-Belsen at the end of the war, but it was the most photographed of the camps of the liberation. So a lot of pictures you see from the Holocaust of the liberation or symbolizing the Holocaust are from Bergen-Belsen. They charged their film and photographic unit to come in right away for the historic record, and so that no one should say this never happened. And of course, it's really hard to describe. As my mother would say, no photograph or film could ever show how horrible it was. And that is the same thing I've heard from every person who was there, a liberator or a survivor. But I tremble in showing you these pictures, just trying to respect that these are all human beings and real people. But you probably could see way more graphic photographs on Google Images. But here's just on the upper left, it shows how the SS officers who remained in the camp, there were maybe 80, several hundred escaped before the handover, were forced to help take the dead bodies and load them onto trucks and bring them to the mass graves. And here on the bottom, you see Rabbi Leslie Hardman, who was the British Army chaplain who was there on the scene right away, who is just bereft at the way people are being buried. And just nobody could have a dignified funeral. And it was very hard for him. And He had conversations with Glenn Hughes about it. It was a terrible situation, how people, and it was actually all the mass graves were labeled with a number of how many people died there, but it was honestly all guesswork. And they had to do it. There was no choice because of the spread of typhus and the threat of cholera with the warm weather coming, and there was a backlog of corpses to be buried. It took the British Army about 2 weeks after to finish burying the dead. And here on this upper right, I have this picture here because you see this girl has a square cut out of the back of her coat. And as my mother shared with me, the laborers, the slave laborers, and almost everybody here in Bergen-Belsen had come from a slave labor camp. They got shipments of clothing that had been taken away from people when they arrived at places like Auschwitz or Majdanek. Anyway, so this woman has a coat, and squares had to be cut out of the back of the coat, lest anyone should try to escape. They would be easily identifiable as Häftling, as prisoners. And here you see 3 days after the liberation, a unit of the British Army set up tents. They brought in a dump of tentage to get people out of the huts. There was about 800 people in a hut that was maybe built for 100 people. And because of the overcrowding, they couldn't get food and water to the people in the huts. So they, those who were ambulatory were moved out into tents. And there's a very dramatic story. This is another picture of the camp and its liberation. These are survivors. There's a very dramatic story of my mom who had to crawl back from a tent into a hut. And it just shows what's happening. Well, I liked the story. I mean, I didn't like the story, but I concluded certain details to illustrate what happened on the ground, because the liberation wasn't like what you would think of a liberation, like everybody cheering and here they're finally free. It was so much more complicated like that, and there was all these dynamics among these very dehumanized prisoners still going on in the camp. And then the rescue. So for those who are medical personnel who may be in on this call, there was PPE then. I mean, here are men of the 11th Light Field Ambulance who had to go into the huts. There was a triage system. There are certain things that happen now. You can't compare the pandemic to Bergen-Belsen, but there are things in the news that always remind me of that history of, you know, what does it take to have to triage people and to make these decisions over who has a chance at life and evacuate them. And these were in contaminated ambulances because everybody had typhus. And then they took them to this cavalry stables about 1.5 miles from the camp, where they set up 60 tables and they pressed German nurses into service to wash and spray DDT on the skeletal inmates. And then they put them in clean blankets into clean ambulances and took them to these makeshift hospital facilities. And just to give you a sense of the news and how I think about things is the survivors, the British managed very quickly within a week to set up this hospital complex in the Wehrmacht Army's facilities. And it was the largest hospital in Europe. It was 14,000 beds, if you can imagine. I mean, they used whatever they could for the beds. But just to give you an idea, yesterday's newspaper said there's a really an uptick in cases of COVID in Rhode Island. So they set up a 335-bed field hospital in Cranston, Rhode Island, and a 594-bed facility at the Rhode Island Convention Center in Providence. So, and I think, okay, so that's newspaper worthy. They set up these hundreds of beds, not even 1,000. And here, very quickly, they had to set up 14,000 beds. And just you'll see a picture later, but they named the survivors because they sensed Glenn Hughes's compassion. They named it the Glenn Hughes Hospital. And there were more in the years after the liberation. There were 2,000 babies were born in the Glen Hughes Hospital, which is a whole other story about the vibrant displaced persons camp that got set up in Bergen-Belsen. The survivors, how they sort of, while grieving, also mobilized. And again, there's a big chapter of that in my book. But here's just some numbers, and numbers are our way for us to grasp tragedies and things, in the newspapers every day and on the television, on the news stations. They're always reporting the numbers of people who contracted COVID and numbers of people who are dying and what's happening in different countries. So it's a way of sort of making sense of things. So just some numbers, just so you have an idea, 440,000 Jews were taken from Hungary to Auschwitz. My mother was part of that. In the spring of 1944, 90% were murdered right away. 440,000 is now roughly the number of deaths of COVID worldwide. This was just in a couple of months in Auschwitz, and just the Jews from Hungary to Auschwitz, just human life to human life. And I'm not talking about the massacre of people by bullets and the Polish Jews and the Jews from Holland and from France. This is just what happened in this period of time to this group. Auschwitz, the summer my mother was there in July of 1944, it was the size of a small city. There were 31,400 female prisoners, close to 20,000 male prisoners in the camp. Remember that Bergen-Belsen wasn't like the way it was in 1945 as it was in the spring of 1944. It got progressively worse as the war progressed, and that very dramatic last year of the war, when the Germans decided to evacuate those who had survived, who had evaded the gas chambers, who were chosen to work for the German effort, were taken to slave labor camps. And then they were moved away from the Russians who were coming from the east. Lest they be liberated, they were forced on these death marches. And Bergen-Belsen was among the places they were deposited, in very, very bad shape already. So actually, it's the survivors who landed in Bergen-Belsen, and then they were dying. There were 55 to 60,000 sick and dying prisoners found in Bergen-Belsen at the time of its liberation. 2/3 were women, 1/3 men, and there were 400 to 500 children. There were about 25,000 who were able to walk, and they set up a transit and rehabilitation barracks for them. And it was really chaotic because it was back and forth. They were still, a lot of them were sick and wound up in the hospital complex. It was back and forth. 750 to 1,000 people were processed each day for over 3 weeks after the liberation at the human laundry. And there were 14,000 people ultimately in the hospital. So Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, came and went without it being really celebrated in Bergen-Belsen. Glen Hughes would not allow for that. The war wasn't over to him until the last person was evacuated from the last hut. All the huts had to be burned down because of the typhus germ was everywhere. So there was a big ceremony on May 21st. So remember, they were liberated on April 15th. The last person was evacuated from the last hut on May 21st. That's how long it took. And they had a ceremony where they burned it down. There was an effigy of Hitler on it, and Glen Hughes gave the order. There he is right here in the picture. And here's a picture of a sign saying the Glen Hughes Hospital. And here's the largest building that was part of that hospital complex. And it was very significant, the burning down of the last hut. Here, this small island nation off Sri Lanka, the Maldives, issued these stamps for the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And one of the stamps was of the British troops burning down the last hut at Belsen. And that was interesting that was such a moment. And that's the actual picture of that event and that the stamp was made from. And here was a sign erected at the concentration camp right after the war, right after. And it was very sarcastic by the British, and it said 10,000 unburied dead were found here, another 13,000 have since died, all of them victims of the German New Order in Europe and an example of Nazi culture. And yeah, I have a lot of, this is my website. I have a lot of pictures of Glenn Hughes and my mom on my website, a lot more. And my book, the last chapter of my book, some people call my book heart-wrenching, and heartwarming, because there is, at least in my mom's case, if there is such a thing as a happy ending, there's a story, there's an epilogue, or I talk about my mom and I talk about Glenn Hughes and what each did with their lives after this experience. And here's the first picture we have of my mother on the upper right-hand side. She had been badly beaten up and she still has bruises on her face and a very vacant look in her eyes. And this is at the first makeshift school hospital she was taken to in Sweden. And she's all alone, and she's 15 here. And then she spent 10 years in and out of tuberculosis sanitarium in Sweden. Here she is as a young lady with my aunt. She's slowly recuperating, coming to her own. She meets my dad. He was also a survivor. Here he is. This is a picture of him on the right in a displaced persons camp. He worked in the kitchen. This is their wedding photo, and this is my mom now. She's 91 years old, and I'm really proud of her. She does a lot of speaking about the Holocaust, and she talks to a lot of high school kids and middle school kids, and it's really quite a blessing to have her. And she really relates well to kids because, after all, she experienced this all as a kid at that age. And here's Glenn Hughes. This is him at Bergen-Belsen, and you can sort of see this real seriousness in his eyes, and the task he has is just, it was unprecedented and shocking. And here he is later. He was a sportsman, and there was a lot to him and his background that I got very deep into in researching his life that didn't make it into the book. He was like a father figure of rugby football. But anyway, what he took from the Bergen-Belsen experience was really significant in terms of his approach to public health medicine and palliative care for the dying, and he inspired the hospice movement. So I'm going to end this now, stop share, and yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Please feel free to type questions into the Q&A function. We'll make sure that they get answered. Our first question is from Nancy. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Britain before the war. Do you know if Glenn Hughes was raised in an anti-Semitic culture? And if so, how did that affect his reaction to the camp?
So that's a great question. He was a doctor in London, and I don't know about his interactions with any people who were Jewish before, but I can tell you that he was a real humanitarian. That was what was striking about him. And when he liberated the camp, and the survivors the strong leaders among the survivors were agitating to go to Palestine and complaining about how they were treated in the DP camp, he was always siding with the survivors. And he was always like showing up at the Zionist Congress and the events and keeping in touch with them. And they became his friends for the rest of his life. He went to every reunion of Belsen survivors, every commemoration. He went to Israel every 5 years, and he was a real champion of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And when I visited his daughter's home, she had albums of him, his trips to Israel, his photos of Moshe Dayan. He was not at all anti-Semitic, and that was the policy of British officialdom at the time. And I don't know what cost it came at. It could, I talk about one thing in my book where it could have really, I just put the question out there whether it damaged his career in some way, his attitude toward the Jews.
Thank you. Janice asked, how long did it take for your mother to be reunited with her sister?
So my mom and my sister and her sister were together for the entire war. Her sister was like a year and a half older than her, and they tried so hard to stick together. And there was one point in Auschwitz where they got separated, where my mom was chosen for the gas chamber. My aunt was chosen to go work in labor, and they went through a lot to try to stay together. But then they sort of, at the very end of the war, they got separated after the liberation, because my mother had to crawl back to the hut. My aunt was in the tent. They couldn't find each other. My mom was sicker than my aunt, and it's a whole big story, but they really fought to stay together, and they kind of knew where each other was. And one of the reasons that my mom was motivated to try to mobilize every cell in her body to try to live was she knew she had a sister who was still alive, who was not in bad shape, and she didn't want to leave her all alone in the world. But they had various separations throughout their whole life somehow, and their destiny was not to be together. Even in Sweden, and then in the United States. My mom wound up in New York, my aunt in California. So
thank you. Sue says this was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you, Sue. One of my questions from reading the book, which I thoroughly enjoy and I highly recommend if you want to pick it up, it's in the chat. There's links to purchase. Part of what you never think, you hear of liberation and you think, okay, and then they just started helping people, but you really delve into the logistics of that it wasn't just, here we are and everything's better, but it took a lot of manpower, a lot of supplies. How did you research it? How were you able to find out? Because this is one of the only books that I've read that really delves into the logistics of that and what it really took to rehabilitate the survivors.
So one of the things when you're a biographer, when you're a writer, one question begets another question, and then you get really deep into it. So you read everything you can. I read everything I could by anyone who liberated the camp. I read everything that Glenn Hughes wrote. I read every speech he gave. I tried to, really find out as much as I could. I read accounts by photographers. I read whatever I could that was written on Bergen-Belsen, and I also carried my mother's stories. So I had like those two perspectives, and I read everything by anyone who witnessed Glenn Hughes, which witnessed him crying and breaking down. So then the question is, you just gather all the materials, all that you're reading, and you're taking notes, and you're having your files, and then you have to try to create the story and try to make it interesting for the reader. And so I just did the best I could with that and tried to really describe what it was actually like on the ground. And yeah, I have to say, it's very educational, because liberation is not what you would think it would be.
Yeah, definitely. We have another question from Nancy. I commend you on how you could maintain your composure when discussing your mother's story. Was it always this way for you as you recorded or listened to her interviews, or did you have to train yourself to separate yourself from this highly personal and traumatic story?
So this is a lifetime's work, and it wasn't work. It was all happened subconsciously. It started when I was like 6 years old, maybe 5, maybe 7, when I started to climb out of my bed at night and want to stay up and talk to my mom, and she'd be alone in the kitchen with her cup of tea and the newspaper, and I would just find that the more questions I would ask her, the more I could get her talking, and the later I could stay up. And here she was, a new immigrant to the United States. She had lived for 10 years in Sweden. And so it started when I was very young, and she was very smart, I have to say, subconsciously. Not that she had a degree in psychology, but she didn't want me to have nightmares, and she didn't want to tell me scary things. So she told me about her adventures in Siget growing up as a child, and it was so interesting and exotic to me. I was growing up on Long Island, and I didn't play games with walnut shells. I mean, the kinds of things that a poor child does, or how. So she had a lot of fun and interesting stories. And then she told me stories about Sweden, and she told me about her adventures and her boyfriends and her work situations, and just a lot of anecdotes. She had a lot of stories to share from her past. And I never realized how poor she was in Siget, or how hard her life was, and how sick she was in Sweden, because she is a positive person. So she was very unspoiled and very appreciative of things. And only when I was a teenager did she start to tell me about what she went through during the war, when I was the age she was when she went through it. And it was really interesting. It was more compelling than what I was learning in school, right, in my history books. And I took my cues from her. I would say it's because I could ask her anything at any time, and she answered me fully, and that I was able to sort of cope, because she was able to look at it from a distance and tell me things honestly, and whatever I wanted to know, she would tell me. I was able to cope with it. It was my personality and her personality. A lot of children of survivors don't want their parents to have these really painful memories. They don't want to ask them. A lot of parents wanted to protect their children, and they didn't want to remember. It was so horrible. But we had a different dynamic. But there were a couple of points when I was writing the book, or even, that I would sit down with her, and I'd want get deeper, and, like a detail about something. And she could get teary, and then I would feel really sad. But we both realized it was really important for the historic record, because a lot of the little stories she told me were like windows into like a bigger historic event.
Thank you. You said your father is a survivor too. Did you have a similar relationship with him in terms of his story and his history?
Not exactly, because he's a different temperament than my mother. My mother is like this. She was like this girl Victor over Hitler. She was like this really interesting protagonist. Like, she wasn't like Anne Frank. She didn't have this privileged upbringing. She was naive and sheltered, but she was in a way able to fend for herself, and she had done all these things during the war that made me think she's so heroic. My father was a more sensitive soul, and I could bring him to tears more easily, but I have to say he was also willing to answer my questions. We had a lot of talks about it. I'm thinking of making my next book about him. And so we didn't have the same relationship. He was a different type of person, much more sensitive inside, I would say. Really a beautiful soul. But he also had certain things that happened that were very fortunate in his life. I mean, he barely survived. He wanted to die during the war. My mother wanted to live during the war. My father he didn't care if he woke up in the morning. But he survived in character for his personality. He was the first Jewish person back in his hometown. But he discovered over the next several months that out of his siblings, 2 were killed in Auschwitz. He had a sister the same age as my mother, and she was the younger in the family, and went with her mother to the gas chamber, and a younger brother. But his 3, he had older brothers. He had 3 older brothers who survived, and 2 sisters who survived. So I had aunts, uncles, and cousins, which was really unusual for a survivor family.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul asks, were there any psychiatrists assigned to the liberation team?
Yes, there were. Glenn Hughes brought in psychiatrists, and it was really interesting what they had to say and observing. And there was one psychiatrist who visited on several occasions, and his first impressions were that these people would never be human again. Like, the chances of them recovering, like they weren't going to behave like normal human beings again. But that was one of the things about Glenn Hughes. He saw the potential, and he did his own analysis of what the recovery might be like. And he realized it depended on people's constitution before the war. And a lot of the nuances. But there, he brought in a psychiatrist, and there's a lot written about that.
Thanks. Sue asks, what happened to your mother's family other than her sister?
So I tell about that. I tell about all of them in the book. It's the Holocaust, in a way, even though the Hungarian deportation came very late in the war, it wasn't until the spring of 1944. Like, the war was practically over. Everybody knew Germany was losing. That's when they rushed to kill all the Hungarian Jews. So even though the war came very late in March of 1945, my mom was affected from the very, very beginning, because the very first massacre of the Holocaust by bullets, you may have heard about the head. They massacred people in the Ukraine, how the Einsatzgruppen followed in Operation Barbarossa. They followed the German army into the Ukraine and were killing people. Her aunts, uncles, and young cousins, that's how I opened the book practically. That was the first massacre of the Holocaust, and that affected her family. That affected her life tremendously. So that's what happened to a lot of her family. And I think that, and she was deported to Auschwitz with her parents, her 4 younger siblings, and her older sister. She had a grandmother who went on a different transport because she went to help somebody else, which was maybe a good thing. Maybe not. You don't know, because sometimes if there was a young mother, like my grandmother was like in her early 40s, sometimes when they got off at the rail station at Auschwitz, the Sonderkommando who had been working there would say to the young mother, give the baby to the grandmother. Just give the baby to the grandmother, because the young mother might have a chance of being picked to work and labor and would have a chance of survival, and the grandmother and the baby would have no chance. Anyway, but I know, I'm quite sure that my grandparents died in Auschwitz. There's a slight chance my grandfather, my mother's father, was also in his early 40s. Maybe he could have been picked to work labor somewhere, but I don't think there's no way he could have survived. And she had a younger brother who was with him who was 12, so I don't think they survived. There were things they did with the young adolescent boys, 12, 13, 14-year-old boys in Auschwitz, that were just horrific, and also with the babies. And this was all happening during the time they were there. So we don't know the exact details, but they didn't make it. Only my mother and her sister made it out of that.
Thank you. One of the other parts in the book that I found interesting was Glenn Hughes really talks about how, as the Allies worked their way east from Normandy into Germany, they were getting help from the liberated countries. So, for example, when they got to France and Belgium, they could take over hospitals and get medical supplies and really helping. And then they hit Germany, and they hit this wall. Suddenly you had to be worried about the hospital that you were taking over, and were they going to work with you? And then it was interesting that once they got to Bergen-Belsen and they liberated, that they were able to force these German nurses to really take an active role in the cleaning, like you said, they did the laundry, the human laundry. And I was just curious, how, if you found in your research, how they described that process, if they were willing. It sounds like they, really did play a pretty important role in that process.
They weren't willing. They had no choice. And at first they came in kind of giggling and snide, and then they broke down crying, and some of them got typhus and got sick, and it was, and some of the survivors didn't want them to touch them. I mean, it was very traumatic that they had to bring in German nurses and even German doctors to the hospital to help, because the inmates didn't trust them, and there was a lot of hysteria around that. But the there were British supervisors of the human laundry. They were walking up and down and making sure that the victims, I mean, you did hear the occasional story of somebody really killing somebody. I read 1 or 2 accounts like that. But basically they had to toe the line and do their work and wash people down and spray them with DDT get them clean, and they did. They had to, and some of them had a lot of remorse and were tearful.
Thank you. Kapokopse, thank you so much for sharing your story. One of the other parts in the book that I thought was so relevant and not heard of very often is stories usually end at liberation for survivors. And you really talk about the 10 years that your mother spent in Sweden really rehabilitating and gaining her life back. Can you kind of talk through some of the experiences that she had post-war?
Yeah. Yeah. So how does somebody go through this? Like, you lost everything, and this was the part of the research that I didn't understand when I was a kid, because again, she had all these like interesting things from Sweden, cooked these Swedish dishes, Swedish flags in our house. We had such a mix of cultures growing up, because Sweden, and Hungary were so much a part of her. But really, it was really hard. I mean, she didn't have parents. She was in and out of TB sanatoriums and rest homes. It took her a long while. She mastered the Swedish language pretty easily. I mean, when I was doing my research, she translated for me this entire 90-page PhD dissertation on the school, the headmaster of the school she was at for 7 months wrote this thing. So it was really quite fascinating. How does somebody come to their own? And it was really instructive in terms of the refugee experience. Like, even now, where there's refugees from all over the world, like my daughter was studying refugees from Burma and coming to this country. Like, how do you treat these children who've witnessed such horrible things? So my mom had the privilege at one point, when she was feeling better, of attending this school for refugee children. The Swedish government that took in the survivors to help them, to rehabilitate them, realized that those who were younger than 18 needed some type of education. So they set up these schools for refugee children. And that was the PhD thesis that she translated. She was at this school for 7 months. And I would say it changed her entire life. I think that it had the greatest impact on her. It was a small school. It's maybe 60, mostly girls, teenage girls, all who had lost so much. So I talk about that in the book, who the teachers were, how they helped these girls, these angry, mournful girls, sort of realize that there was something to strive for, and they had to make decisions for themselves, and that there was good in this world, and there was culture, and there were things to learn. And it's just really, my mom took it all in because she missed so much school. So like, now if you were to walk into her house, like as I was growing up, there's always classical music playing. She's always listening to opera and watching, and her sort of tastes were cultivated in this kind of. And this was different than my father's sisters, my other aunts and uncles, who didn't have this kind of education. So in terms of bringing refugee children back to life, there's a lot that's instructive in the last chapter of my book.
How were you able to connect with Glenn Hughes's family?
So that's a great question. So I had this like crazy idea like 16 years ago, like, I'm going to write a biography of Glenn Hughes. Like, he, everybody who I spoke to who knew him in this country, the survivors, they all said he's like this great man. And he's like this Oscar Schindler type guy. So I'm going to go to London, and I'm going to see how I could like meet everybody who knew him who's still alive. So how many Hugheses do you think there are in the London phone book? Like, how do you even, like, this is like the craziest idea. And what's his daughter was married. What's her married name? Like, how am I going to find out? So I looked first. I was advised to look under who's who in like British history. And I looked under Hughes, and it said every organization that he was ever a part of. And I wrote to every single one of those organizations, all the schools where he was an alum, where he went to medical school, where he went to his public school, which was a private school in England, the Barbarians Rugby Football Club, the Royal Army Medical Corps Museum. I wrote to everybody, and I started to get responses back. And it just so happened that his school that he attended, which was for the sons of medical men, just like that next week, his daughter and son-in-law were coming to bring his books to donate to the school. So that's how I got connected with his daughter, and I went to see her and before she died, and spent a couple of days with her and her husband, and just tracked down whoever I could of his surviving friends. It was a race against time because he died in 1973. I started to do this research like in 2004, 2005, and everybody was that I was interviewing was like in their 80s. So I was lucky to track them down.
Yeah, definitely. I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight and for this really important conversation. I think we all learned a lot. I invite you to purchase copies of All the Horrors of War. In the chat, there's 2 links. Johns Hopkins University Press has 40% off for the next couple of days. You can also purchase through Reeds and Company, which is our independent bookstore vendor. Thank you so much, Bernice, for joining us.
So
and
much.
I hope everyone has a good evening. We'll see you back here Monday night. We have Bess Cobb for her memoir about her grandmother. Take care and have a great night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.